Okay, right. When last we left the spaceship Swine Trek, um, before the exam, I'd gone over the structure of eukaryotic cells. And I assume everybody was impressed with the fact that they are pretty complicated little gizmos. Um, Considering the fact that the smallest one of them is, roughly 1/1,000,000th of a meter in size, they pack a lot into a pretty small space. And we've talked about within the cytoplasm, you have the nucleus, the mitochondria, which are, of course, the power plants of the cell, because that's funny. We talked about the endoplasmic reticulum. We talked about the Golgi and how that's involved in transporting proteins through the cell. I didn't mention them, but here's the centrioles, and those are involved in cell division with when the spindle fibers form. And we've got some smooth ER over there and rough ER. I don't know, I said smooth ER, and it's suddenly it reminded me of a Michael Jackson song. It'd be something like, enzymes, are you okay? Are you okay? Are you okay, enzymes? You were synthesized, you were produced on the smooth ER. Sorry, folks, haven't had the coffee, so that was amazing. Okay, well, that could be a good thing or a bad thing, but I'll take it in a good sense. Right. And you might have left wondering with how all of this came into existence. This is a very complicated thing. And I get to introduce the work of a great woman scientist who I got to meet a couple of times before she passed, Lynn Margulis. And in 1970, she was teaching at Boston University in Boston. And she published a book called Origin of Eukaryotic Cells. And put it this way, she was, like all scientists, she was building on ideas that had been proposed by people that came before. All of us do that. So she wasn't absolutely the first to have ideas like this, but she was able to back them up in and put them together in ways that nobody had done before. And what she proposed was an answer to the question of how eukaryotes got to be so complex. And the answer is that eukaryote mitochondria, the power plant of the cell, are evolutionarily descended from free-living bacteria. And these are bacteria that used to swim around roughly 2-ish billion years ago, maybe a little more than that. And about 2 billion years ago, they penetrated into an early eukaryotic cell. Some very, very distant ancestor of the eukaryotes, 2-ish billion years ago. We do have fossils that are that old, so we know that bacterial life was around. And these bacteria took up residence inside the eukaryotic cell. It's possible that the eukaryote cell was trying to eat them and just couldn't digest them. It's possible that the bacteria were penetrating a eukaryotic cell because they were parasitizing it. Both of those are possible. We may not have all the details, but what we think happened was that these bacteria developed a relationship with the host in which each came to depend on the other. When you have a very close relationship between two unrelated species, we call it symbiosis. And the specific type of symbiosis that we're talking about here is a mutualistic symbiosis. Mutualism refers to a biological relationship in which two or sometimes more species depend on each other to depend on each other to survive. That's mutualism, where both partners in a mutualistic symbiosis benefit. And the idea is that mitochondria used to be free living, but they have lived so long inside eukaryotic cells that they're no longer able to live outside. They're so integrated into eukaryotic cells that we don't even think of them as ever having been free. We think of them now as just parts of a eukaryote, but they didn't used to be parts of eukaryotes. She argued that the same thing was true for chloroplasts, those green dots that you saw floating around inside Elodea leaves in the second lab you ever did. They're descended from free-living bacteria that are photosynthetic, and they entered some early eukaryotes, started living inside, and developed a mutualistic symbiosis where each one, the eukaryote host and the photosynthetic bacteria, came to depend on each other. And incidentally, when we have a symbiosis like that, where one partner is living inside the other, it's called endosymbiosis. Endo being either Latin or Greek, I forget which, for inside. Sounds like a really weird idea at first, but one of the things that I want you to remember is this: evolution sometimes gets stereotyped as being all about survival of the meanest and the ugliest and the fiercest. You know, when people talk about survival of the fittest, which, by the way, is a phrase I really hate, they're usually thinking about, you know, the meanest wolf in the pack tearing apart the helpless moose, or the most savage lions on the Serengeti plains savagely tearing apart an antelope, or the meanest great white shark ripping apart the helpless tuna, or whatever it might be. And one of the things I know I mentioned way back, maybe a couple of months ago by now, one of the things I know I mentioned is that evolution is not usually about that. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but one of the big themes is that very often the organisms that manage to not just survive, but reproduce and make more like themselves are not the most savage individuals. They are the most cooperative. And this is a big time case where that happened. Our eukaryotes are not historically single cells, they're collectives. So what kind of evidence is there for this? This actually sounds kind of weird. Well, one of the ones is that mitochondria turn out to have their own DNA. Chloroplasts have their own DNA. It's not DNA in the nucleus. Usually mitochondrial and chloroplast DNA does not form strips like a eukaryote chromosome. You know, remember that a chromosome is basically just one long strip of DNA with, you know, one end and another end. All right, checking the chat here. Okay, yeah, good point that the alphas in a wolf pack are not the meanest, and that whole alpha wolf business is a misinterpretation of the way wolves were acting in zoos, not the way they act in nature. Slight digression there, but good point, Ian. Back to mitochondria and chloroplasts. You might remember that bacterial DNA is organized in a loop. So is mitochondrial and chloroplast DNA. Their DNA is organized in loops. And remember that we've got a way to sequence DNA. We can line up sequences from different organisms. And by looking for similarities and differences, we can draw up cladograms. It turns out that the DNA inside mitochondria and chloroplasts is more like bacterial DNA than it is like eukaryotic DNA. So mitochondria in chloroplasts have their own DNA. It looks genetically related to bacterial DNA. Mitochondria and chloroplasts also have their own ribosomes. One little thing I didn't mention is that eukaryotic ribosomes are a little bigger than bacterial or archaean ribosomes. It's not really a big deal, except that generally mitochondria and chloroplast ribosomes are smaller, like bacterial ribosomes, not as big as the ribosomes you'd find in the rest of a eukaryotic cell. So they've got their own DNA, they've got their own ribosomes. You can kill them by antibiotics, antibiotics that attack bacteria. Some of them will kill mitochondria and chloroplasts. This is why there's a lot of very effective antibiotics that can't be used because they'll make, because they'll kill off mitochondria and, make the person even sicker. They'll kill bacteria, but they kill mitochondria too. And once a eukaryote, mute whoever that is, please. Mute. Okay, right. Thank you. If you could mute. All right. Pretty good flow. Pretty pretty dope. Right. And if a eukaryote loses its mitochondria and chloroplasts, it cannot replace them on its own. There are some protists that have chloroplasts. The protist will survive if you take out the chloroplasts, but the protist after that has to feed. The protist can never regenerate chloroplasts once they're gone. This happens to be a map of different genes on mitochondrial DNA. Don't worry about the abbreviations and all of that. It's not critical here. There, admit somebody. It's not quite enough DNA to survive independently because a lot of mitochondrial, what used to be mitochondrial DNA, is now part of eukaryotes' nuclear DNA. But it's enough DNA that this is why a eukaryotic cell cannot replace mitochondria if it loses them. Mitochondria have to duplicate their own DNA, and they divide in much the way that bacteria divide. And again, it's like bacterial DNA in that it's a loop, not a linear chromosome. If we do a cladogram based on DNA sequences, don't worry about all these species names up here, but in the blue box right here, we've got those represent DNA sequences from the mitochondria of certain protists. All right, checking the chat right here. There we go. And it turns out that they share an inferred common ancestor with the DNA of a particular type of bacteria called rickettsiotes. And all of these names up here, right there, that represents DNA sequences from other types of bacteria. So mitochondrial DNA is not only similar in its sequences to bacterial DNA, but it's specifically similar to a particular group of bacteria called the rickettsiotes. So we know what mitochondria's closest cousins are. They're still around. So mitochondrial DNA is like bacterial DNA. Chloroplast DNA is also like bacterial DNA. I didn't show you that, but it is. And another line of evidence, this is a picture of a mitochondrion that's been sliced in two, imaged by a gizmo called the transmission electron microscope. And mitochondria have a whole bunch of membrane folds on the inside. We don't need to worry about what they do. And surrounding them all is a double layer of membrane. You can see there's one layer of membrane. There's a second layer of membrane. Chloroplast is much the same. Two layers of membrane. And that only makes sense if you assume that at one time we had a eukaryote up here that doesn't have mitochondria or chloroplasts, and then it engulfed a bacterium, whether it was trying to eat it or whether the bacterium was a parasite, we don't know. It's not critical here, but it engulfed a bacterium. And when it did that, the outer membrane pinched off, and we have the bacterium now surrounded by a double membrane, one membrane belonging to the bacterium and one originally coming from the host eukaryote. A third line, yet another line of evidence, is that this is not the only time this happens. And in fact, symbiosis is all over the map in the living world. There are cases absolutely everywhere where you have two or sometimes more than two species that are not closely related, and yet that live together in a very tight relationship that we call symbiosis. Here's a nice example. On the right, that is an ocean creature that's called a brain coral. These are the sorts of things that build up coral reefs out of the huge, heavy skeletons that they build. But they have living tissue as well. And in this species, the living tissue is green. Why is it green? Inside the living tissue of a coral, not all corals, but certainly all tropical corals that form reefs, those corals depend on having single-celled algae that live inside them. And this is what they look like under the microscope. These little greenish balls, they carry out photosynthesis. They grow using sunlight inside the coral. They use the coral's waste products as fertilizer, and the coral can harvest them to get food for itself. So the coral is not going to live very long without those algae. A coral that's under stress may actually kick its algae out. That's called coral bleaching. And coral bleaching is actually a danger sign. It means the coral's in danger of death. But as long as the coral's healthy, it's going to depend on these algae living inside it. And the algae living inside it depend on the coral. That is a type of symbiosis. In particular, it's a type called mutualism, where each depends on the other. The algae can't live outside the coral, and the coral is not going to live for very long without its algae. And in fact, this happens to be a protist. It's called Pollinella. Don't have to worry too much about the details of it. It's a single eukaryotic cell, and you might notice that it's got its thing that I'm outlining right now that looks kind of like a bent green sausage inside it. That is a type of photosynthetic bacterium. It's a type called a cyanobacterium, and it carries out photosynthesis. And then the entire protist, the whole Pollinella, depends on this bacterium living inside it as a major source of food. So the Pollinella can't live very well without the blue-green bacterium inside it, and the blue-green bacterium can't live outside of the Pollinella. The two are absolutely dependent on each other. This is not the ancestor of all photosynthetic eukaryotes, but it gives us some insight into what those earliest eukaryotes may have been like. Okay, this is a modern organism, but the ancestors of photosynthetic eukaryotes like algae and plants were probably pretty similar to this. We can still get some insights into what these past organisms look like by looking at present day examples. And there's lots of other examples I could have given. You could teach a whole course in this stuff. We find it everywhere we look. This type of symbiosis specifically is called mutualism. And in mutualism, each partner depends on the other. Here we've got a honeybee. The honeybee is sipping nectar and picking up pollen from this flower. The honeybee is getting food. What the flower is getting out of the deal is that as the honeybee goes from flower to flower, the bee is going to transfer pollen. And pollen, if you remember, is, let's just say that pollen grains contain sperm cells. So flowering plants reproduce sexually, but since flowering plants can't pick up their roots and walk over and, say, hey, baby, to potential mates, they have to come up with other ways of transferring pollen from one plant to another. And there's lots of ways that they can do this. One of them is to produce nectar and extra pollen for insects like this honeybee to eat. And then as the honeybee goes from flower to flower, the honeybee will transfer pollen from one to the other and make it possible for this plant to make seeds. And honeybees are not the only organisms that do that. You've got bats and moths and even flies that can be pollinators of different flowering plants, depending on the species that you've got. So that's an example of mutualism that you can see, anywhere you've got nice flowers on a warm summer day. And this is all over the place in ecology, which is the last really big topic we're going to hit. We're going to be talking about ecology from now till the end. So there we go. There's a honeybee that's covered in pollen grains. She feeds on nectar, which is sweet, sugary liquid. She transfers pollen from one flower to the other, enabling the plants to produce seeds and fruits. And this is what we call mutualism, because ultimately both partners benefit. I'm assuming that this isn't news. I can remember my kid watching it was a Cat in the Hat video where the Cat in the Hat explained how all of this works, about the busy bees making all the plants and flowers grow. Right. And again, bees are not the only pollinators. That is a tropical fruit bat eating a flower and getting pollen all over his face. And as bats fly from flower to flower, they transfer the pollen of certain plants. The ones that you might know would be things like mangoes, guavas, agave, right? No fruit bats means no tequila, because that's what you make out of agave. The orchids that produce vanilla, that produce these vanilla seed pods, those are pollinated by tropical bats. There are butterflies that do pollination. There are moths that will do it. Some hummingbirds can do it. There's even some flowers that are pollinated by a mutualistic relationship with flies. These tend to be flowers that smell really, really bad. You would not want to give a fly-pollinated flower corsage to your prom date unless you really didn't like them. Okay, honeybees are invasive. Technically, yes, honeybees were native to Europe. Well, at least the species that we commercially raise here are native to Europe, Apis mellifera. That being said, there are thousands of species of native bees in the United States. They don't produce honey, but they do pollinate our native plants. Bumblebees, for example. There's a guy named Coleman Little whose office is right across the hallway from where you guys do lab. And he is in fact a specialist in our native bees. Yeah, very good person to talk to. Yeah, there are thousands of native bees. There's dozens of them that I think he's documented living in the nature reserve. So they're not hard to spot. You just have to kind of, know what you're looking for. Okay, another example you can see on campus. That's a tree branch with lichens growing on it. All of those kind of greenish gray or orange crusty growths. You could see these on trees. You could see them on old stones. Old gravestones or walls that have been around for decades will develop a coating of lichens if they're not cleaned. And they're not actually plants. What they are is what you get when certain fungi and certain algae, certain single-celled photosynthetic protists grow together. For some, you can isolate the fungus and the algae, and when you grow them apart, they don't look anything like each other. But when they grow together, the protists get a protected place to live, and the fungi get their nutrients from the protists. Up until fairly recently, it was thought that a lichen consisted of one fungus and one protist. We actually now know that lichens contain two different fungi growing together with one species of photosynthetic protist. This is actually a three-way symbiosis. By the way, a little bit of historical trivia. The scientist who worked out that lichens were not single organisms, but they were mutualistic symbioses of fungi and algae growing together, she made the discovery back in the 1800s, and she wrote it up, and unfortunately no one would publish it because she was a woman in Victorian England, and women were not supposed to do science. No one would take her seriously. Well, she was disappointed by that. She was able to illustrate her discovery with very well done drawings and watercolors, because they didn't have cameras that could take pictures through a microscope at the time. So she was a talented artist as well as a good scientist. And when she couldn't be a scientist, she turned her talents to writing kids' books. She's the one who wrote The Tale of Peter Rabbit. She actually wrote a whole series of kids' books about animals. There was Mrs. Tiggywinkle, the hedgehog, and Jemima Puddle Duck, and a bunch of others, but The Tale of Peter Rabbit is her best known. Her name was Beatrix Potter. And it's great that she wrote kids' books. It's really a shame that she was not allowed by the standards of the time to do science, because she was a very good scientist, and credit for the discovery of lichens being symbiotic actually ended up going to somebody else, some German dude named Schwendener. Right. Yeah. All the more reason to make sure that girls are encouraged to learn about science instead of discouraged. Okay. I think I mentioned this way back when, but there's many plants that have fungi that grow into their roots. The fungi get nutrition from the plants, and the plants actually benefit from having the fungi there. They actually get certain minerals from the fungi that their roots are not as good as extracting from the soil if they don't have the fungi. You're actually looking at a sample of a plant root that's been laid on a microscope slide, squashed and stained blue. And the plant root cells are kind of rectangular shaped. I'm outlining a couple for you right there. Those are the plant cells. And then these round things that are connected up with each other by these filaments that I'm outlining kind of like that, those are the actual fungi growing inside plant root cells and extending outside the plant roots and going for quite some distance through the soil. In fact, the same fungal filaments, the same mycelium, a word you should remember because you're gonna see it on the final, can actually connect separate plants. Plants that are growing apart can actually have a connection through these fungi. And the fungi are called mycorrhizae. Rhiza is Greek for a root, and myco means a fungus. So mycorrhizae just means root fungi. And 95% of all plant species depend on mycorrhizae. This is not meant to be an ad for this particular brand, but you can actually buy mycorrhizal fungus spores to add to your potted plants. And 95 of all plant species will not grow very well unless they've got mycorrhizae living inside their root systems, even if you give them plenty of water and fertilizer. You can see the big difference that having mycorrhizae makes. And yeah, you can buy mycorrhizal spores. I used to get them at Lowe's in the garden section to add to your potted plants, and it does seem to be quite effective. Okay, but mutualism is not the only type of symbiosis. There's a second type called parasitism. These are ears of corn with a fungus growing on them, producing fruiting bodies or sporocarps. You might remember sporocarps from way back when. Mushrooms are one example of sporocarps. This is a different type. And this particular fungus is known as huitlacoche in Mexican Spanish. No, Ian, I spelled it right. And the corn is being harmed because its seeds are getting eaten by this fungus, by Eustolagomyces. With the fungus growing on them, the corn's not going to be able to reproduce. And of course, the fungus is benefiting. The fungus is benefiting because it's getting its food from this corn and ultimately is going to produce lots of spores and go on to infect other corn plants. So that's a case where the fungus is a parasite on the corn. Incidentally, some of you may know this, huitlacoche actually tastes pretty good. I know it looks kind of gross, but it's pretty yummy. You can buy canned huitlacoches in Mexican grocery stores, and it tastes pretty good. So that would be a case where, you know, the huitlacoche is bad for the corn, but it benefits people because, you know, it's pretty delicious. Just yesterday, I won't say where, but my wife came across a tree stump that was growing a lot of fungi, a lot of mushrooms. And these particular mushrooms would ultimately have killed the tree. They'll grow on living wood just as well as dead wood. And they would have killed the, you know, if the tree had been alive, they would have killed it, given enough time. So that would be another parasite. This fungus called Desarmillaria cespitosa that would have been a parasite on the tree. But they happen to be quite tasty mushrooms, and we had some last night. But yeah, from the tree's point of view, those mushrooms would have been parasites. Oh, sorry, should have warned you. That's human intestine. And that's a human that just had an operation for the removal of parasitic roundworms called Ascaris that can live inside human intestines. They take nutrition away from the human host. So if you have these in your guts, you're malnourished. And if you have too many of them, they can block the intestines completely, which requires surgery if you're not going to die. So yeah, that is another great example of a parasitic relationship where humans lose and the worm gains. The worms benefit at the host expense. And my other class this semester is actually on parasitology. So we talk about lots of worms that can infect people and animals. If you have pet dogs or cats, you may have had to worry about heartworm or tapeworm or things like that. Those are all examples of parasitism, where one partner benefits and the other is harmed. The third option you can get is called commensalism. And in a commensal relationship, one partner benefits and the other is neither helped nor harmed. There's a cow that I think this picture would be taken in India because the birds that are standing around the cow, I think, are native to India, although they've been introduced here. And as a cow, or I mean, before humans had cows, it would be just, any big mammal walks around, eating grass, it'll stir up insects. And cattle egrets will walk right behind the cow and pick up the insects that have been stirred up by the grazing cow. So the egrets are benefiting from the cows because as the cows walk, they stir up insects that the egrets can eat. The cows aren't really benefiting, but they're not really harmed either. We do have cattle egrets here, although I think they were introduced. I don't think they've always been in North America, but yeah, we get them. The cows don't really get any benefit, but they're also not hurt. So the egrets benefit, the cows are neutral. So those are your three basic types of symbiosis. Mutualism, where both benefit. Parasitism, where one benefits and one is harmed. And commensalism, where one benefits and the other is neutral, neither helped nor harmed. And we find that all three of those we find all over the living world. There's examples in your backyard. And that's the way that we segue from cell biology to our last big topic, ecology. By the way, oikos is the Greek word for a household. So ecology is the study of the household. Except the household in the case is not just your house, it is the entire natural world. It's the study of how organisms interact with each other and how they're affected by their surroundings, by the ecosystem that they're in. By the way, it's the same eco as in economics. Economics means law of the household. Although the household in case may be your own personal household, but it could also be the whole federal government or anything in between. But that's ultimately what ecology and economics have to do with each other. They both come from this word for household. And we can study ecology at various levels of organization. If we're studying population ecology, that's the set of all members of one species in one area. That's a population. You could go out right now if you're on campus and walk into any grassy area and start studying the population of all clover plants in on the grass outside of Torreyson Library or something like that. You could go out and study the population of all willow oak trees in the UCA Nature Reserve, or the population of all black bears in the White River National Wildlife Refuge, or the population of all people in Valonia. All of those is a population. It's the set of all members of one species in one area. When we talk about the way how different populations affect each other, we're talking about an ecological community. So you could go out and study, if you wanted, the fish community in Lake Conway. That would be the populations of all of the different types of fish you know, uh, bluegills and crappie and bass and gizzard shad and minnows and whatever else is in there, and how all of those populations of fish affect each other. We'd be studying the fish community. We could talk about studying the tree community of the nature reserve if we wanted to look at the ways in which willow oaks and red oaks and turkey oaks and sweet gums and pecans and whatever we've got in there, the way that all of those trees affect each other. We'd be talking about community ecology. If we want to talk about the set of all communities in one area, considered together with all of the non-living factors that are important for them, we'd be talking about ecosystem ecology. So we could talk about the ecosystem of the nature reserve as a whole, let's say, and we'd be talking about, you know, what's going on among all of the populations that live there, all of the species that live there, and how they're all affected by things that are not alive, but nonetheless important, like the amount of sunlight, the amount of rainfall, the available water that's present, the temperature, the humidity, possibly, you know, the type of rock that the soil is ultimately coming from. None of those are actually living, but they're all extremely important for the living things that are there. And by the way, something that is not living, but that's ecologically important, we call abiotic. Biotic means something that's living. So a biotic factor in an ecosystem would be something like, I don't know, the insects that are eating the plants, or the bacteria that are causing a disease, or something like that. The abiotic factors would be things like sunlight and rain and climates, et cetera, that are important for the ecosystem, even though they're not technically alive. If we're talking about a set of similar ecosystems over, you know, a whole continent or even farther than that, we'd be talking about a biome. So for example, a lot of the central and western United States used to be covered with a type of grassland called prairie. Most of this has been plowed right now, but there's still a little piece of prairie in the heart of the nature reserve, which gives you an idea of what the entire state of Arkansas would have once looked like: patches of prairie mixed with patches of trees. There are similar dry grasslands in places like in Europe, in Hungary, they call it the puszta. In Argentina, those grasslands are called the pampas. In Africa, they call them savanna. But they're all examples of the same biome. Even though they don't even contain the same species, they're all broadly similar in that they all are somewhat dry. They encourage grasses. They'll tend to have similar types of soil. So that semi-arid grassland would be an example of a biome. Tropical rainforest is another example. There are tropical rainforests in Africa and South America and Australia. Those would be examples of the same biome. Sorry, checking the chat here too. Yes, the prairie does extend up into Montana. That's part of the central and western US, even Canada. And then if we want to talk about the set of all life on Earth, that's called the biosphere. So I'm going to start by talking about populations. Let's say we have a group of living things in one species, a population of animals, plants, it doesn't really matter what it is. If we could provide that population with all of the resources that every member needed, with all of the food they needed and all of the water and just the right temperature and all of the space, just provide everything that was necessary, that population would grow exponentially, meaning it would double over a fixed length of time. If you started with 2 bunny rabbits, after a certain period of time, there'd be 4. After another certain period of time, there would be 8. After another interval of time, there'd be 16. And then there'd be 32 and 64 and 128 and 256 and 512 and so on. And if you graph that against time, you have number of generations on the x-axis below and the size of the population on the y-axis. You get a curve that goes up and keeps getting steeper and steeper and steeper. And we call that an exponential curve, or it's sometimes called a J curve because it sort of, looks like a letter J. Okay, there, I've just kind of drawn a letter J. I assume you get the idea. That's what exponential growth looks like, and that is the way a population would grow if there was nothing limiting its growth. It would just continue to double and double and double again. You will not have to solve this equation on the exam. There is no math on it. But what defines exponential growth is this equation. The population at any specified time is equal to the population that you started with, N0, multiplied by a number that is about equal to 2.7, a number called E. You might remember that that is the natural logarithmic base, if you remember that from high school or college algebra. And then E is raised to the power of T, that's the length of time that the population's been growing, times R. And R is called the intrinsic rate of increase. It's a number that expresses how steeply that population is increasing. If R is equal to 0, if R was equal to 0, then E to the power RT would be equal to 1, and the population would never increase. The population after any length of time would just be equal to the starting population. If R is greater than 0, then that population is going to go up, and it's going to double over a fixed length of time. The bigger R is, the faster the population growth rate increases. The steeper that curve gets. Okay, I will be coming back to that. And again, you do not have to memorize that equation, and I promise you will not have to solve it. You're not going to need calculators for the final. Just to give you an idea, here's a couple of fruit flies that are mating. I don't know if I should show this to you. You're kind of impressionable young students. But the life cycle takes, under ideal conditions, it takes about 7 days. 7 days between mommy fruit fly laying eggs, and then the eggs hatch. They hatch into maggots. The maggots form pupae, and the pupae hatch into new adults that are ready to breed. That breeding cycle time takes about 7 days. You can work this out mathematically. If you start with 1 pair of flies, in 1 year, you'd end up with a ball of flies that's the size of planet Earth. It should be obvious that this can't happen in the real world because the planet Earth has not been completely replaced with a ball of nothing but flies. It might seem like it that way, but no, it hasn't. And it can't happen in the real world because something has to be acting to keep populations down. We actually talked about this when I was talking about evolution. We talked about how Thomas Malthus pointed out that all populations have the potential to increase in size indefinitely, just keep going. But in nature, we don't see that. Populations tend to stay fairly constant, although they might zigzag a bit. So some things have to be acting to keep the populations down. So it could be predators, it could be parasites, it could be disease, it could be a lot of things. But one of the factors that keeps the population down is the fact that there's not enough food for everybody. In a real population of fruit flies, the population will grow, but eventually it hits a point where it starts running out of food. And some of your baby fruit flies begin to starve to death before they can breed and produce more fruit flies. You know, there's only so many overripe bananas in your kitchen. And once those are gone, there's not enough food for all of the fruit flies. And there's many factors that can do this that determine an ecosystem's carrying capacity. That's the maximum number of individuals that can be stably supported in an ecosystem. And the factors that affect the carrying capacity can be both biotic and abiotic. Biotic factors could include the presence of prey or other food sources. They could include the presence of parasites, the presence of predators, maybe even the presence of mutualistic symbionts. All of these things can influence what the carrying capacity is. Abiotic factors would include things like the amount of sunlight, the temperature, could be levels of moisture, the amount of oxygen presence, you know, exactly what is going to depend on what specific population you're talking about. But all of these are going to influence the maximum number of individuals in a population that the ecosystem can support. That's the carrying capacity. If we make a simple model for this, populations that start out small might grow and reproduce rapidly, but as the population starts getting close to the carrying capacity, it'll start slowing down, it'll stop growing exponentially, and it'll start leveling off. We call this logistic growth, by the way. And this type of growth curve is called a sigmoid curve. Sigmoid means shaped like the letter S. Or, okay, technically it means shaped like the letter sigma. But we use sigmoid often to mean S-shaped. Your large intestine includes a portion called the sigmoid. You might have heard of the sigmoid colon, or people getting a sigmoidoscopy. That just means the S-shaped part of your large intestine. And this graph right here, okay, it's like a very open S. Oh, like the S in yeah, the S in Star Wars is a very open, right? Is a very open S like that. Okay. So the sigmoid curve, it's S-shaped. It shows populations growing exponentially for a while and then beginning to level off. I should mention, by the way, that this is not because the population somehow discovers birth control. This is not the population saying, oh, hey, wow, we're starting to use up all of our resources here. Let's all just take really cold showers for a while. The population is not consciously responding to this. What's going on here is that when a population is close to carrying capacity, when it's up here on this level, the individuals are still reproducing and still being born, and the population is holding still because at this stage, births are balanced by deaths. Up here on the level, births and deaths are equaling each other. For every new individual in the population that's born, another individual in the population dies, probably because it's starving to death. And so birth and death balance each other out. So these populations are not leveling off because the population, it's not like the fruit flies are deciding they're going to start wearing condoms. It's because that at this level, if the population goes above carrying capacity, more of them die. So that leveling off is where births balance deaths. It is sometimes possible for a population to overshoot the carrying capacity, and it might go up and then fall back down. It might go up and then maybe zigzag a bit. That can happen. It can even fluctuate wildly and chaotically, depending on the circumstances. So I should mention that, by the way, that carrying capacity here is spelled with a K, because in the mathematical equations that we use to draw these curves and describe population growth, carrying capacity is abbreviated with the capital letter K, just as the intrinsic rate of increase is abbreviated with a lowercase r. So when species, sometimes you'll get species that can vastly overshoot K. This is a picture from 2013 on the island of Madagascar, when there was a huge population explosion of locusts, similar to grasshoppers, voracious plant eaters. And this swarm of locusts devastated the island and ate a ridiculously large number of plants. And then once they'd eaten all the plants, they all starved to death and died. So occasionally you'll get a population that might vastly overshoot K and then crash. That can happen. Populations don't always slowly and neatly rise to meet K and then collapse and then stay. They don't always rise to meet K and then hold steady. Sometimes they overshoot and then crash. By the way, we can use the same math to model the course of epidemic diseases. That's a sigmoid curve shaped like the S in Star Wars. But what it represents is the cumulative number of cases of Ebola virus infection in West Africa between 2014 and 2016. You might remember that about 6 years ago, there was a big Ebola outbreak in Africa, and that curve ought to look very familiar. At first, there were very few cases, and then it rapidly spread, and eventually the number of cases leveled off once the virus ran out of people to infect. So yeah, it's the same math that ecologists use to study populations. This was some COVID, these were our COVID cases back in spring 2020, which was only a year and a half ago, although it seems like goddamn forever. And you might remember back in the old days, there was a lot of talk of trying to flatten the curve. And flattening the curve just meant people taking action that would reduce the rate at which that curve is going upward, because at this stage, the number of people infected with COVID was going up exponentially, using the same type of math that you could use to measure the exponential growth of a population. You can use to model the number of people affected with a disease. I'll mention that the math used to model epidemics actually uses a slightly different number called capital R0, but it's related to the R that we'd use in population ecology. So the same kind of tools that we can use to look at the growth of a population of fruit flies or locusts or anything else can be used by public health experts to track and try to predict the course of a disease. And we've been doing quite a lot of that ever since March of 2020, 1,000 years ago. There's lots of other cases. This will be the last thing I talk about. Populations can influence each other in complicated ways. And this is some great data from northern Canada. Northern Canada used to be owned by the Hudson Bay Company, this big private company that was chartered by the British Crown. And among other things, they used to buy animal furs from trappers. If you lived up in northern Canada, you'd trap animals, you'd harvest their pelts, and you'd sell them to the Hudson Bay Company. And they, in turn, would put them in warehouses and then ship them to, whatever place wanted furs. And because the trappers were never numerous enough to wipe out an animal species, they never took more than a little bit. The number of furs that are trapped in any given year is a pretty good estimate for how big the population was. So the records of the furs that have been bought by the Hudson Bay Company give us an idea of how large populations have been of fur-bearing mammals in northern Canada, and the records go back over 150 years. And in particular, we can look at two species of fur-bearing mammal. On the right, that is the Canadian snowshoe hare, an adorable little fuzzy mammal that has brown fur in the summer and white fur in the winter. And over on the left, that is a Canadian lynx, an adorable little kitty cat that loves to eat snowshoe hares. That's the main food of the lynx in winter. By the way, lynxes have these enormous feet, which enables them to run in soft snow, and enormous feet with big claws that enable them to grab and eat snowshoe hares. So, yeah, I'm not sure who you're rooting for here. They are both adorable. The lynx is an adorable, deadly predator. Anyway, when you look at the populations of snowshoe hares and lynx, the hares are shown in blue, and you can see that hare populations go up and down in roughly a 10-year cycle. The lynx population also goes up and down in a 10-year cycle. The lynx population shown there in red. And what I want you to notice, if you look very carefully, is the lynx population usually peaks just a bit after the hare population peaks. So, right, we've got the hare population peaking here, and then it looks to my eyes like the lynx population is peaking there. That's maybe 2 years later. And then here's the hare population peaking, with the lynx population peaking just a little bit after. And there's the hare population peaks that year, and then the lynx is not far behind, and so on. The lynx population is also cycling boom and bust roughly every 10 years. But the lynx population is just a little bit behind the hares. Why is that? Well, it goes like this. Hares are the lynx's main food supply. So here you've got a lynx going after a hare in the Canadian winter. And hares will breed like rabbits, because that's what they do. And if you have a small number of hares in a forest and they breed, the hare population increases in numbers. Well, guess what? The more hares there are, the more food there is for the lynx. So mommy lynx can raise more kittens because she's better fed and she can make more milk. And the lynxes start becoming more abundant because there's more hares for the lynxes to eat. The problem is that when the lynxes get to be abundant, they eat many more hares, right? More lynxes means more hares get eaten. And when there's too many predators, the hare population starts falling. I guess you could say the lynxes start suffering from hair loss. Yeah, they should join the hare club for lynxes. Sorry. Rotten jokes, I know. So the hare population falls when there are too many lynxes. Well, the hare population falling suddenly means that there's less food for the lynxes, Mommy lynxes can't raise as many babies. They can't make enough milk. Some of those babies are going to grow up, not be able to find enough food, and they'll die because nature's a mother. It happens. The lynxes become less abundant when there's less food. But when the lynxes become less abundant, now the hares can start increasing in number again. And then when the hares have increased in number, then the lynxes will follow. But once the lynxes are common, the hares will drop. Once the hares have dropped, the lynxes will drop, and you get this regular cycle repeating on about a 10-year time scale, where populations of both hares and lynxes boom and bust, but the lynxes are always a couple of years behind the hares. So we're starting to get into community ecology here, because this is the kind of things that populations do when they influence each other. Neither the hares nor the lynxes are really limited by carrying capacity. Instead, each one is affected by what the other one is doing. So we get these regular cycles of population size. That's actually a fairly good place to stop. We'll talk about competition when we come back next Tuesday. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording now.